In a hunter-gatherer camp roughly 15,000 years ago, a woman in her 20s has tried for 6 years to carry a child to term. She has not managed it once. There is no clinic to visit, no doctor to explain why, no name for what is happening inside her body. Her camp numbers perhaps 30 people, and every one of them depends on cooperation to eat, to move, to survive the next season. In a species where passing on genes is supposed to be the entire point of existing, what happens to someone whose body will never do that? Does she get pushed to the margins of the group? Does she starve alongside the elderly when food runs short? Or does something else happen? Something the fossil record and the oldest written laws on Earth both hint at. Something stranger and more organized than most people assume. That single biological outcome turns out to touch a real share of everyone who has ever lived. Across every continent where humans left a written or physical trace of themselves, a large fraction of any given generation never had biological children at all, whether by choice, by illness, by an accident of timing, or by simple bad luck. Historical population records put that number as high as 1 person in 5. If ancient societies genuinely had no answer for what to do with those people, evolution should have stripped out any instinct to care about them. It did not. The record shows elaborate legal systems built around exactly this problem. Religious roles reserved specifically for people who would never raise children of their own, and skeletons of individuals who could not have contributed a single calorie toward their own survival, buried with the same care as anyone else. Something kept them fully inside the group. This is the story of what that something was. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Most people, asked to guess, land on one of 2 pictures. The first is brutal. A childless woman in the deep past was expendable, left behind when resources ran short because she offered no future generation to justify feeding her. The second is romantic and just as wrong. Ancient communities were so tightly bonded that nobody would have noticed or cared whether a person had children, because everyone raised everyone's children together. Both pictures contain a grain of truth, and both miss almost everything that actually happened. The brutal version gets one thing right. From a strictly genetic standpoint, a person who leaves no offspring leaves no direct genetic line of their own. Natural selection, in the narrowest textbook sense, has nothing to reward in that person's survival. If evolution operated purely on an individual competing to pass on its own genes, childless group members really would be dead weight, with no particular reason for a foraging band to spend scarce calories keeping them alive. That simple version cannot account for what actually survives in the record. Neanderthal skeletons tens of thousands of years old show old men who had lost the use of an arm, who were partially blind, and who had gone years without functional teeth, all clearly fed and protected by people who owed them nothing in strictly genetic terms. The oldest written law codes on the planet contain entire clauses dedicated to protecting and providing for people who could not produce heirs. And in dozens of unrelated cultures, from Rome to the northern plains of North America, some of the highest status roles in the entire society were reserved specifically for people who would never have children of their own. Something more complicated than pure reproductive math was operating underneath all of this, and biologist William Hamilton worked out what it was in 1964, decades before any of this archaeological evidence had even been excavated. Hamilton was trying to explain something that had puzzled biologists for a century. Why do worker bees, who never reproduce themselves, spend their entire lives caring for their queen's offspring instead of having their own? His answer became known as kin selection, and it rests on a simple insight. Genes do not need an individual to reproduce directly in order to spread. They only need copies of themselves to survive into the next generation, and a share of those copies sits inside every relative a person has. A person with no children of their own still shares roughly half their genes with a full sibling, a quarter with a niece or nephew, and an eighth with a great-niece or great-nephew. Helping those relatives survive and reproduce, Hamilton showed, can spread a person's genetic material almost as effectively as having children directly, provided the cost to the helper is smaller than the benefit delivered to the relative, weighted by how closely related they are. That relationship became known as Hamilton's rule, and it rewrote the assumption that evolution only rewards direct offspring. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy took that theory out of the math and into the archaeological and ethnographic record. In her 2009 book Mothers and Others, Hrdy laid out a case that human children, unlike those of almost any other great ape, have never been raised by a mother acting alone. Chimpanzee and orangutan mothers carry, feed, and protect their infants almost single-handedly for years. Human infants, by contrast, are passed around constantly from birth, held and fed and watched by grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated group members, Hrdy termed alloparents, a word borrowed from ecology, meaning any caregiver who is not the biological parent. Hrdy argued that this shared care system stretched back well over 1 million years, because human infants are born so helpless and stay dependent for so long that no single mother, foraging on her own schedule, could have kept one alive through infancy without help. A childless adult inside that system was not extra weight. They were part of the infrastructure that let every child in the group survive at all. Anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado documented exactly this kind of network in real time among the Ake, a forest-dwelling people in eastern Paraguay whose foraging life they studied closely beginning in the 1980s. Hill and Hurtado recorded extensive food sharing that crossed household lines entirely, along with a formal practice of fictive kinship in which unrelated adults, including people with no living children of their own, took on recognized caretaking roles for orphaned or otherwise vulnerable children in the band. Those relationships were not vague goodwill. They carried real obligations, tracked and expected by the whole group, functioning as a working substitute for the biological kin ties Hamilton's math would otherwise require. How many people in the deep past actually fell into this category? Nobody excavating a hunter-gatherer camp 30,000 years ago left behind a census. What survives instead is a set of comparisons drawn from the closest available proxies: skeletal populations, historical parish and tax records from early agricultural societies, and controlled fertility studies from communities that never used contraception. In 1957, demographer Christopher Tietze analyzed birth records from Hutterite religious communities in North America, a population that practiced no birth control and married early, giving researchers close to a best-case measurement of natural human fertility. Even under those conditions, Tietze found that a small but consistent share of married couples, somewhere around 2 to 4%, never conceived at all across a full reproductive lifespan, a figure demographers still use as a rough baseline for pure biological sterility in humans. Layer onto that baseline everything the deep past added on top: partners lost to violence or disease before children were grown, women who died in the extraordinarily dangerous process of childbirth before raising a single child to adulthood, and infections that scarred the reproductive tract without killing the person who carried them. That last category grew sharply worse once humans started farming. Bioarchaeologists Mark Nathan Cohen and George Armalegos, comparing skeletal health markers across the transition from foraging to agriculture in their landmark 1984 study, documented a measurable decline in health once people settled into permanent villages, including more childhood malnutrition and more infectious disease spreading through populations dense enough to sustain it, a density small mobile foraging bands rarely reached. Pelvic infections in particular scar and block the fallopian tubes without producing dramatic symptoms at the time, ending a person's chance of pregnancy years before anyone in their community understood why. Historian Peter Laslett, working through the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, reached similar territory from parish and family reconstitution records in early modern England, estimating that a meaningful share of adults in past societies never married or never bore a surviving child. Put the numbers together across biology, mortality, and disease, and researchers studying pre-modern natural fertility populations arrive at a working range of roughly 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 adults reaching the end of their reproductive years without a living child of their own. That is not a rare exception tucked into the margins of history. That is a substantial fraction of every generation that ever lived. The evidence is not limited to women, and the ancient legal record is fairly blunt about that. Hittite legal texts from Anatolia, dated to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, include divorce provisions that address a husband's inability to father children, treating male infertility as a recognized, nameable condition rather than something automatically blamed on the wife by default, an assumption that dominated large parts of Mesopotamian and later legal traditions. The imbalance in how blame was typically assigned overwhelmingly onto women's bodies regardless of the biological reality shaped who carried the social cost of childlessness far more than it reflected who actually caused it. If losing an entire genetic line to pure bad luck was this common, and this unevenly blamed, the next question follows immediately: what did the people around a childless person actually do about it? One category of childless ancient person deserves its own explanation, because it is not really about infertility at all. It is about a strange fact of human female biology that sets our species apart from almost every other mammal on Earth. Most female animals remain fertile until close to the end of their natural lifespan. Human women typically stop being able to conceive somewhere in their 40s or early 50s, then go on living for decades afterward, often outliving the point of reproduction by a third or more of their entire lifespan. From a narrow evolutionary lens that makes no obvious sense, a body that keeps investing energy in staying alive long after it can no longer reproduce should, in theory, be a dead end for its own genes. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, working with James O'Connell and Nicholas Blurton Jones, spent years among the Hadza, a foraging community living around Lake Eyasi in northern Tanzania, who still obtain much of their food through hunting and gathering, using methods that have changed very little across generations. Hawkes and her colleagues tracked exactly how much food different members of Hadza camps brought back each day, sorted by age and sex. What they found, published in a widely cited 1997 study, was that Hadza grandmothers past their own childbearing years were among the most productive foragers in the entire camp, spending long hours digging deeply buried, difficult tubers that young mothers with infants strapped to their bodies simply did not have the time or freedom of movement to extract. That food went straight to their grandchildren and to their daughters, who were freed up to wean children earlier and have their next child sooner, because a grandmother's foraging was covering the nutritional gap. Hawkes called this the grandmother hypothesis, and the logic underneath it connects directly back to Hamilton's math. A woman past childbearing age who spent her remaining years provisioning grandchildren was still spreading a quarter of her genetic material forward through each grandchild she helped keep alive and fed, without personally bearing any more reproductive risk. Over enough generations, natural selection could favor a longer post-reproductive lifespan for exactly that reason, because women who lived long past menopause and kept working on behalf of their daughters' children outcompeted women who did not, measured in surviving grandchildren. Menopause, on this account, is not a malfunction. It reads closer to a second career, and it means a meaningful share of every older woman in ancient human history was, functionally, one of the childless people this entire question is about, arriving at that status through age rather than infertility. She was no longer a mother, in the direct sense. She had become something the group needed, just as urgently. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Grandmothers and aunts covered a lot of ground, but they did not solve every version of the problem. What about a married couple who wanted an heir and had none? In a world where property, land, and the right to perform funerary rites for aging parents all passed down through named children. Egyptian physicians had already been trying to diagnose exactly that problem for over 1,000 years before any of the surviving legal solutions were written down. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, discovered at the Fayum site of Lahun and dated to roughly 1,800 years before the Common Era, is the oldest surviving medical text on Earth dealing specifically with women's reproductive health, and it includes fertility tests such as having a woman sit over a mixture of dates and beer while a physician watched for vomiting, a folk method with no real diagnostic value, that nonetheless shows physicians treating infertility as a medical question worth investigating, not simply a matter of fate. Mesopotamian societies did not leave the inheritance side of the question to informal kindness. They wrote it into contract law. At the ancient city of Nuzi, in what is now northern Iraq, archaeologists excavating in the 1920s and 1930s recovered thousands of clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform, dating to roughly the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era. A large number of them are adoption contracts, and they are strikingly specific. One typical tablet records a childless couple formally adopting an adult man as their son, obligating him to support them in old age and carry out their funerary offerings after death, in exchange for inheriting their property once they died. Other Nuzi tablets describe couples adopting specifically so the adopted child could then marry and produce grandchildren for them, effectively contracting for a bloodline they could not produce themselves. These were binding legal agreements, witnessed and sealed, because in Mesopotamian religious practice, an ancestor with no living descendant to pour offerings for them was believed to become a restless, hungry spirit. Childlessness was treated as a practical threat to what happened to a person after death, and the law responded accordingly. The Code of Hammurabi, compiled under the Babylonian king of that name around 1754 years before the Common Era, went further, laying out detailed provisions for exactly this situation. Several of its clauses address a married man whose wife has not borne children, permitting him to take a second wife or father a child through an enslaved woman in his household so the family line could continue, while also specifying obligations the first wife retained. Modern readers, reasonably, focus on how coercive and unequal these arrangements were, particularly for the enslaved women who had no choice in the matter at all. What the code also shows is how seriously ancient Mesopotamian law treated childlessness as a problem requiring an institutional fix rather than a private grief to be quietly endured. Egypt built its own version of the same logic. At the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built royal tombs across the Nile from Thebes, a document now known as the Adoption Papyrus, dated to around 1150 years before the Common Era during the reign of Ramesses XI, records a woman named Naunakta formally adopting several children and reorganizing her inheritance around them in old age, explicitly excluding children who had neglected to care for her. The document reads less like sentiment and more like careful estate planning, because in Egyptian belief, just as in Mesopotamian belief, having someone alive to maintain your tomb, speak your name, and provide offerings after death was the difference between existing in the afterlife and being forgotten entirely. Across two of the oldest literate civilizations on Earth, independently, childlessness produced the same institutional reflex: write it into law and solve it through adoption. Adoption solved the inheritance and afterlife problem for people who wanted children and could not produce them biologically. A separate and much stranger pattern shows up across unrelated cultures, societies that took certain people out of the reproductive pool entirely, by design, and rewarded them with some of the highest status available in the entire community. In Rome, the priestesses known as the Vestal virgins were selected as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, from patrician families, and bound to 30 years of service tending the sacred flame of the goddess Vesta under a strict vow of celibacy. Breaking that vow carried the death penalty, buried alive in an underground chamber, according to Roman sources including the historian Plutarch. In exchange, a Vestal held a legal position unlike any other woman in Rome. She was released from her father's legal authority. She could own property and make a will in her own name. She could testify in court without a male guardian's backing, and she was given a reserved seat of honor at public games. A Vestal virgin was, functionally, a woman whose entire social value rested on the fact that she would never bear children. Granted a level of legal independence ordinary Roman mothers and wives were never given at all. North America offers a different version of the same underlying pattern. Among a number of indigenous nations, including several Plains and Southwestern peoples, anthropologists have documented recognized social roles, sometimes referred to in modern scholarship using the umbrella term two-spirit. for individuals who did not follow the reproductive path expected of their assigned sex at birth. Accounts recorded by ethnographers among the Zuni, the Lakota, and other nations describe such individuals taking on specialized ceremonial, healing, or mediating roles within the community, often treated as carrying a particular kind of insight precisely because they stood outside the ordinary marriage and childbearing structure of the tribe. One of the better documented individuals is Wifa, a Zuni Lamana who lived through much of the 19th century and was closely observed and recorded by anthropologist Matilda Coke Stevenson during a lengthy stay in Zuni Pueblo in the 1880s. Wifa never fathered or raised biological children, worked as a respected weaver and potter, and served the community as a religious and diplomatic figure prominent enough to travel to Washington and meet sitting officials as a representative of the Zuni people. The specifics varied enormously between nations, and colonial-era records describing these roles are frequently unreliable, filtered through outside assumptions, which is why contemporary scholars treat the older ethnographic literature with real caution. What survives across the more carefully documented accounts, though, is a consistent structural feature, a role built specifically around someone who would not have biological children, folded into the community's ceremonial and social life rather than treated as a gap needing an explanation. Not every ancient society responded to childlessness with adoption law and honored social roles. Some responded with punishment, and the clearest example comes from Rome itself, which makes the contrast with its own Vestals sharper. In 18 years before the Common Era, the Emperor Augustus pushed through a set of laws known as the Leges Iuliae, expanded further in 9 years of the Common Era under the Lex Papia Papia, aimed directly at citizens who remained unmarried or childless. Under these laws, an unmarried adult, termed calebs, and a married but childless adult, termed orbis, faced real legal penalties. They could inherit only a reduced share, or in some cases nothing at all, from the wills of people outside their immediate family, at a time when inheritance was one of the primary ways wealth moved through Roman society. Citizens who had produced 3 or more children gained specific privileges instead, including earlier eligibility for public office. The historian Tacitus, writing decades later, described the resentment these laws produced among Rome's elite, who found creative legal workarounds, including fictitious adoptions and sham betrothals to minors, specifically to dodge the penalties. Rome ran 2 opposite systems on childlessness at once, revering a small number of women for permanent celibacy, while legally punishing the ordinary citizen for the exact same reproductive outcome. The hardest version of this problem was not a legal penalty at all. It was total isolation, a childless person who had also outlived or lost every sibling, cousin, and close community tie that might otherwise have supported them under Hamilton's kin selection logic. Ethnographic and historical accounts from resource-scarce environments, including some Arctic and subarctic hunting societies, described by early 20th century ethnographers, record cases of elderly or infirm people with no surviving kin being left behind during a hard seasonal move, when a camp had no way to carry them and no genetic obligation compelling anyone to try. These accounts are contested by later researchers, some of whom argue outside observers overstated how common the practice actually was, and the surviving evidence is thin enough that certainty is not really available. What is better documented, and in some ways more revealing, comes from far earlier in the human story. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated the remains of a Neanderthal man, now known as Shanidar I, who died somewhere around 45,000 years ago in his 40s or 50s, elderly by Neanderthal standards. His skeleton shows a withered, partially amputated right arm, severe vision loss in one eye from a healed skull fracture, significant hearing loss, and arthritis that would have made walking difficult. Every one of those injuries had healed years before death, which means for years, a man who could not hunt, could not see clearly on one side, and likely could not hear a predator approaching from certain directions, was fed, protected, and kept alive by people around him. Whatever the theoretical genetic math said about the cost of supporting someone who could not contribute, the group did it anyway, tens of thousands of years before Rome ever wrote a law about it. Shanidar I is not an isolated case. In 1908, at La Chapelle aux Saints in southwestern France, quarry workers uncovered the skeleton of another elderly Neanderthal man, first studied by French paleontologist Marcelin Boule and reanalyzed decades later by paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus and colleagues using modern imaging. That skeleton shows advanced arthritis in the jaw, spine, and hip, along with the loss of nearly every tooth well before death, changes that would have made chewing solid food difficult or impossible for years. Someone was almost certainly softening his food or preparing it for him long before he died. Two unrelated Neanderthal sites, excavated decades apart and hundreds of kilometers apart, tell the same story. A body that could no longer earn its keep in any conventional sense was still worth the trouble of keeping fed. Step back from any single case, and a pattern holds across every one of them, whether the evidence comes from a cuneiform tablet, a Roman legal code, or a Neanderthal's healed skull fracture. Human societies never actually operated on the narrow, individual version of survival of the fittest the phrase conjures in casual use. They operated on networks, obligations that extended sideways to siblings and nieces and unrelated camp members, not only downward to one's own children. A person who could not have children was rarely pushed outside that network. More often, they were rerouted into a different position inside it. An alloparent freeing up a mother's labor, a grandmother digging the deepest tubers in camp, an adopted heir maintaining a family's offerings to the dead, a Vestal guarding a city's sacred flame, a healer standing at the edge of a community's ceremonial life. Cooperative breeding, the arrangement Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy traces back well over 1 million years, explains why human infants survived their extraordinarily long childhoods, and it explains why an individual with no children of their own was rarely written out of the story. In a species that raises its young collectively, everyone who helps raise a child, related or not, is doing reproductive work, whether their own body ever carried one or not. That arrangement has not disappeared. It is visible today in adoption law that traces its basic logic straight back to Nuzi and the adoption papyrus. In modern grandparents whose unpaid caregiving still measurably improves grandchildren's outcomes the same way Hadza grandmothers' tuber harvests once did, and in the plain fact that most people can name at least one adult from their own childhood who was not their biological parent, and who still shaped who they became. The ancient version of this question was never really about a single childless person facing the world alone. It was about whether the group around that person had already built a place for them before the question ever came up. Most of the time, across most of human history, it had. The single fact worth carrying out of all of this is the healed bone. Not the law codes, not the Vestal's reserved seat at the games, not even the grandmother's basket of tubers, striking as all of that is. Shanidar I lived for years after an injury that should have ended him immediately, in a species operating on the brutal logic people usually assume the deep past ran on. Someone cut his food into pieces he could manage with one working arm. Someone walked slightly slower so he could keep pace. Someone, 45,000 years before anyone wrote a word down, decided that a man who could no longer hunt, see clearly, or hear danger approaching was still worth keeping alive. That decision carried its own calculation, made on a longer and less obvious ledger than direct offspring alone, no less deliberate in its own way than a Nuzi adoption contract or a Roman inheritance law. A species that survived by raising its young collectively had every reason to keep every willing pair of hands inside the network, whether those hands had produced a child or not. Ancient humans who could not have children turn up again and again in the record, across tens of thousands of years and half a dozen unrelated cultures, folded back into the arrangement that kept the next generation alive. The line did not end with them. It ran through them differently. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.